The tariff must have really hit the coffee industry because I'm telling you right now, the prices that I'm seeing right here in my grocery store is absolutely insane. Check this out.
What if I told you the taste of your morning coffee could be changed forever, not by a drought, not by a bad harvest, but by the stroke of a politician's pen? It happened quietly on August 1st, 2025. While most Americans were waking up and brewing their usual cup, Washington made a move that would ripple across kitchen tables, coffee shops, and international trade boardrooms alike. A 50% tariff slapped on every bag of coffee coming from Brazil overnight. No negotiation, no gradual phase-in, just a blunt, brutal hit to one of America's most important import partners. And Brazil? They didn't beg, they didn't plead, they didn't even pretend to negotiate. The Brazilian president's words were as sharp as the policy itself: "I will not humiliate myself." And with that, the world's largest coffee producer, the country that supplies almost 1/3 of all coffee consumed in the United States, began packing its bags and looking elsewhere. For decades, Brazilian beans have been the invisible glue holding together the U.S. coffee market. From the Dunkin' blend your parents swear by, to the smooth Arabica in your Starbucks latte, to the budget-friendly tins in every supermarket aisle. And now, with one policy change, that glue was about to melt. The question is no longer just how much will coffee cost. It's who will still be able to afford the taste they love. And more dangerously, what happens when coffee is only the first domino? It started as a line in a press release, the kind of thing most people scroll past without a second thought. But for the coffee industry, it landed like a thunderclap. On the morning of August 1st, 2025, the U.S. government announced a 50% tariff on coffee imports from Brazil. There was no drawn-out debate, no public hearings, no gradual transition period. One moment, coffee flowed freely across borders. The next, every bag, every shipment, every container from Brazil came with a price tag inflated by political decision-making. For most Americans, coffee isn't just another grocery item. It's a ritual. The first thing you reach for in the morning. The scent that tells you it's time to wake up. A small, comforting certainty in a world that feels anything but certain. And yet, with a single policy change, that comfort was about to become more expensive and possibly harder to find. The strangest part? The United States doesn't even need to protect its domestic coffee industry because there isn't much of one to begin with. Coffee can only be grown in a few tiny U.S. regions, like Hawaii's Kona Belt or certain microclimates in Southern California. Together, they produce a fraction of what the country drinks, mostly premium, high-priced specialty beans for niche markets. Meanwhile, U.S. coffee consumption is enormous, over 24 million bags a year, worth about $3.6 billion. That's an average of 11 pounds per person annually, and most of it comes from imports. And within that massive import system, Brazil is king. The South American giant supplies nearly 30% of all U.S. coffee imports, more than any other country in the world. It's not just about quantity either. Brazilian Arabica beans are the heart of America's coffee blends. They bring balance, smoothness, and consistency to products from Dunkin', Starbucks, Tim Hortons, Folgers, Maxwell House, and even Costco's Kirkland brand. For decades, these beans have been the quiet foundation of America's coffee identity, something so reliable that most people never stop to think about it. Until now, because the 50% tariff didn't just hit Brazil's profits, it instantly erased the competitive price advantage Brazilian coffee has always enjoyed in the U.S. market. Import costs jumped by an estimated 25% to 35%, depending on when contracts were signed. For the big brands, that means higher operational costs. For smaller roasters, it's a devastating squeeze on already thin margins. And for the everyday shopper, those percentages translate into something brutally simple. The $6.90 bag of ground coffee you picked up last week is now $8 or even $9 in high-cost states like California and New York. The bigger question lingering behind all of this was one no politician seemed eager to answer. Who exactly is this tariff protecting? Not the average coffee drinker, not the small cafe owner, and certainly not the brands that rely on affordable imports to keep shelves stocked. It was a question Brazil answered not with words, but with action, by quietly beginning to turn away from the U.S. altogether. For years, coffee was one of the few pleasures that seemed safe from the relentless march of inflation. Bread got more expensive, gas prices jumped, rent climbed. But coffee, even with the occasional bump, it stayed within reach, the daily treat people didn't feel guilty about. That illusion shattered almost immediately after the tariff hit. Importers passed the extra costs down the chain, and by the time the beans reached supermarket shelves, the math was impossible to ignore. Before August 2025, you could walk into a U.S. grocery store and buy a pound of standard ground coffee for around $6.90 to $7.00. The kind of coffee you grew up on, the kind you could brew every morning without thinking about the cost. Now, the national average has climbed to $8.13, and in places like California and New York, Some brands are crossing the $9 threshold. It's not just a dollar or two more. For a family that drinks 3 to 4 pounds a month, that's $36 to $60 more every year. And that's if they stick to the basic stuff. For those who prefer organic, fair trade, or specialty blends, the monthly increase can hit $8 to $10, adding up to well over $100 a year. That might not sound catastrophic to some, but in a time when many households are already cutting back on essentials, even small increases force trade-offs. That extra money could have gone toward a tank of gas, a couple of school lunches, or the cold medicine you hope you won't need this winter. Now, it's evaporating in your morning cup. And here's the cruel twist. Even if you're willing to pay more to keep your coffee routine, you might not be able to. The tariff didn't just raise prices. It set off a chain reaction that's already shrinking the supply of Brazilian coffee heading to the US. Brazilian exporters have always relied on volume and competitive pricing to dominate the market. Take away the pricing advantage, and suddenly the US doesn't look like such an attractive buyer. Shipments that once came to American ports are now being rerouted to Europe, Asia, and anywhere else that won't slap a 50% penalty on them. This isn't about scarcity. Brazil still produces enough to meet global demand. It's about profitability. And when profit margins vanish, so does the incentive to prioritize your market. For American consumers, that means something even worse than higher prices: less choice. The blends you've trusted for decades could quietly disappear from shelves, replaced with beans from other countries that may be harsher, more bitter, or simply unfamiliar. And if you think big brands will protect you from that change, think again. Many will quietly reformulate to keep costs down, swapping in cheaper beans from other origins. You might not notice it right away, but one morning you'll take that first sip and wonder why it just doesn't taste the same. This is where the tariff's real damage begins, not just in the dollars leaving your wallet, but in the slow erosion of the small, familiar pleasures that make daily life feel steady. In global trade, relationships are everything. And for decades, the relationship between Brazil and the United States was as steady as they come. The US was a reliable buyer, and Brazil was the dependable supplier that kept American coffee drinkers happy, caffeinated, and loyal to their favorite brands. But relationships can break in an instant. By August 6th, just 5 days after the tariff took effect, there were already signs of a quiet retreat. Brazilian exporters weren't reducing shipments because demand was down. They weren't cutting back because of a bad harvest. The beans were still there, warehouses still full. The problem was simple. With the 50% tariff in place, the US was no longer a profitable market. Why send 8 million bags of coffee to a country that punishes you for doing business when there are other buyers eager to take your call? Brazil didn't slam the door. They just started looking for other exits, and the response from the rest of the world was almost instantaneous. In Beijing, the government fast-tracked hundreds of new Brazilian coffee companies for export approval. It wasn't just a symbolic move, it was an open invitation. We'll take what the US won't. The European Union followed suit. South Korea, Japan, and other coffee-loving nations quickly put in their bids. A major German supermarket chain even signed a memorandum of understanding with a cooperative in Minas Gerais, the very same region that had been a top supplier to American companies for decades. These weren't just random business deals. They were the early signs of a strategic realignment in the global coffee market, one where the US no longer held the position of preferred buyer. For Brazil, it was simple math. The US now meant high tariffs, unpredictable politics, and shrinking profits. Asia and Europe meant stable contracts, no extra taxes, and a chance to grow in emerging markets. And while American consumers might think their coffee supply is too big to fail, here's the truth. Global suppliers will always go where the profit is. If that's not the US, they won't lose sleep about sending their best beans somewhere else. The shift may feel invisible now. Shelves are still stocked, supermarket brands haven't changed their labels. But under the surface, contracts are being rewritten, shipping routes are being redrawn, and Brazil is slowly, methodically stepping back from the US market. It's not an emotional decision, it's a survival strategy. And once those new trade relationships are locked in elsewhere, it's incredibly hard and expensive to get them back. When a giant like Starbucks faces a supply shock, it doesn't panic. It calls in the procurement team, renegotiates contracts, taps into global networks, and absorbs the hit, at least long enough to rework the supply chain. The brand is strong enough, the customer's loyal enough, that a small price bump won't drive people away in droves. But the independent coffee shop, the corner cafe in a small town, the family-owned roaster that's been serving the same community for 20 years, they don't have that kind of cushion. For them, the tariff is a tidal wave, and most don't have the lifeboats to survive it. Here's the reality. More than half of all small cafes in the US use Brazilian beans as the base for their standard blends. Why? Because Brazilian coffee isn't just affordable, it's dependable, mild, easy drinking, consistent in quality. The kind of coffee that works well for regular customers who want something familiar, not experimental. When that supply suddenly costs 25 to 35% more, these cafes have three options, none of them good. Absorb the cost and watch profits evaporate. Raise prices and risk driving away customers. Switch to a cheaper bean that changes the taste people have come to love. And if you think customers won't notice the difference, ask the Nebraska cafe owner who's been brewing her Taste of the Old Street blend, 70% Brazilian, 30% Colombian, for over a decade. When her distributor raised prices by nearly 40% after the tariff, she was forced to switch to a cheaper Robusta from Asia. The flavor profile changed overnight. The smooth, mellow taste her regulars loved became sharper, more bitter. The first week, customers made polite comments. It's a little different today. By week 3, many had stopped coming in altogether. Morning foot traffic dwindled. Revenue that had been steady for years began to slide. She cut hours for her barista. The pastry case emptied out earlier each day. The shop felt quieter, not just in sales, but in spirit. Multiply that story by thousands. In small towns and suburban neighborhoods, cafes are more than businesses. They're part of the social fabric. They're where people meet before work, where retirees read the paper, where students hunch over laptops. When those places close, it's not just about losing a cup of coffee. It's about losing a gathering place, a sense of community. And make no mistake, the closures will come. Some cafes will survive by slashing menus or laying off staff. Others will quietly disappear, replaced by another empty storefront. And all because a tariff aimed at protecting an industry that barely exists in the US struck hardest at the people least able to adapt. The worst part? Many of these small cafe owners don't even know how bad it's going to get. Right now, they're struggling with the first wave of cost increases. But when supply contracts expire in the coming months and new prices kick in, the hit will be even harder. For big chains, it's an accounting problem. For independents, it's existential. And the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that America's coffee culture will lose one of its most important human-scale elements, the neighborhood cafe that knows your name, your order, and exactly how you like your cup poured. While Washington was flexing its muscles and Brazil was recharting its trade routes, Canada stayed quiet. No retaliatory tariffs, no fiery speeches, no sudden policy changes. And in that deliberate stillness, Canada may have made one of the smartest moves in the global coffee game. In 2024, Canada imported just over 111,000 tons of coffee from Brazil. That's only about 4% of Brazil's total exports, barely enough to make the country a serious player in the global supply chain. But here's the thing, Canada's imports from Brazil were already growing at a steady 7% per year before this crisis even began. Now, with the US effectively taxing Brazilian beans out of competitiveness, Canada has become the obvious low-risk alternative for Brazilian exporters. No tariffs, no threats, no unpredictable political swings, just a stable, wealthy consumer base that already has a deep coffee culture. And that culture is no joke. According to the Coffee Association of Canada, 72% of Canadian adults drink coffee daily, one of the highest rates in the world. The coffee market there is worth nearly 8 billion Canadian dollars annually, making it the nation's second most consumed beverage after water. Yes, more than beer, more than soft drinks, more than tea. This stability is gold to Brazilian producers. In trade, consistency is currency. It's not just about the price you can get today, it's about knowing the buyer will still be there tomorrow, next year, and the year after that. Canada offers that. The US, at least under current policy, doesn't. Already, industry analysts are predicting that Canada's imports of Brazilian coffee could jump by 67 million USD in value over the next few years, the third largest projected growth globally, behind only France and one other European country. For Canadian roasters, that means locking in high-quality beans at prices unaffected by the political turbulence to the south. Walk into a Tim Hortons in Toronto or a Kicking Horse Cafe in British Columbia, and you won't see panic on the menu board. Prices are steady, the coffee tastes the same. Customers aren't being asked to sacrifice quality for cost. And while Canada hasn't made any official announcements about expanding its partnership with Brazil, the groundwork is already being laid in the simplest way possible, by staying open for business. By choosing not to stir the waters, Canada has positioned itself as the calm harbor in a storm that's rocking the rest of the global coffee trade. For Brazil, it's an irresistible combination. No tariffs to slash profits, no political pressure to bow to foreign policy demands. A strong, loyal consumer market with high per capita coffee consumption. In other words, everything the US no longer offers. And here's the kicker. As more Brazilian exporters shift shipments north to Canada, those supply lines could become permanent. Once you build a reliable new route, it's hard to justify going back to a volatile one. If that happens, Canada won't just be benefiting from the US-Brazil rift. It will have quietly elevated its role in the global coffee trade, all without firing a single policy shot. If you think this ends with Brazil, think again. Whispers are already circulating through trade circles, and they're not coming from fringe sources. They're coming from people who have spent decades in the coffee business. The word is that Washington isn't stopping at a single 50% tariff. Multiple major producers are rumored to be next on the list: Vietnam, Colombia, Ethiopia, Indonesia. If that list looks familiar, it should. Together, those four countries, along with Brazil, make up nearly 70% of the entire global coffee supply. And each of them brings something unique to the table. Vietnam dominates the robust, high-caffeine Robusta market. Colombia produces the smooth, balanced Arabica beloved by North American drinkers. Ethiopia is the birthplace of coffee itself, known for floral, complex flavor notes. Indonesia supplies rich, earthy beans used in specialty blends worldwide. Cutting off or taxing these producers isn't like closing one door, it's like locking up most of the house. And when you do that, the air inside starts to get stale very fast. The futures markets are already sounding the alarm. Since June 2025, the price of Arabica coffee has jumped nearly 35%, from $1.75 per pound to around $2.40. Robusta has surged even more violently, up 56%, from $125 to $195 per pound. Those are not small fluctuations. They're the kind of spikes that ripple through entire economies, from farm workers in Ethiopia to cafe owners in Chicago. And here's the dangerous part. These price surges are happening before any new tariffs on those other countries have even been confirmed. This isn't just speculation. It's the market bracing for impact. Traders are already factoring in a future where the US becomes a hostile buyer for most of the world's top coffee producers. For other nations, this is a golden opportunity. Canada, the European Union, and several Asian markets are already in talks to secure larger, long-term contracts with these same suppliers, offering them the stability that Washington no longer seems able to provide. In other words, while the US is threatening to wall itself off, the rest of the world is quietly taking over its connections. This isn't just about beans and brew. Coffee is a test case, a preview of what happens when one of the world's largest consumer markets weaponizes tariffs against everyday goods. If it works politically, what's to stop the same approach from being applied to tea, cocoa, wine, or even staple foods like rice? Global suppliers are paying attention. They're asking themselves a simple question: why risk selling to a country that could slam the door shut overnight? The answer is pushing them toward markets where the rules are predictable, the contracts are honored, and the profits aren't at the mercy of a news cycle. And that shift isn't temporary. Once trade patterns change, they tend to stay changed. The risk is that the US may wake up in a few years and find itself no longer the center of the coffee universe, but a high-maintenance customer suppliers avoid unless they have no other choice. What started as a political gesture toward one country could become a long-term, self-inflicted wound, one that reshapes the very taste of the American morning. For decades, the United States didn't just drink coffee. It defined the global coffee market. Starbucks, Peet's, Green Mountain, these weren't just brands. They were empires that shaped how coffee was grown, marketed, and consumed around the world. The US wasn't simply a customer, it was the trendsetter. Farmers in Colombia adjusted their harvest schedules based on American demand. Roasters in Vietnam tailored their bean processing to fit the flavor profiles US buyers preferred. Prices on the New York Coffee Exchange set the tone for the rest of the planet. That dominance wasn't just about consumption power, it was about trust. Suppliers knew that selling to America meant big orders, long contracts, and a relatively stable political environment. You might not always get the highest price, but you could count on the relationship lasting. But that reputation is now showing cracks. When you slap a 50% tariff on your largest coffee supplier and hint that more could be coming for other top exporters, you send a very clear message. Our market is not guaranteed, and in global trade, uncertainty is poison. Suppliers start asking hard questions. What if they raise tariffs again next year? What if this policy shifts with every election cycle? What if we invest in logistics for the US, only to get shut out overnight? It's not paranoia, it's precedent, and it's pushing exporters toward markets with fewer political landmines. Canada, Europe, Asia, these regions aren't just willing to buy, they're building partnerships, multi-year agreements, infrastructure investments, co-branding opportunities that give producers a stake in the success of the final product. In other words, they're offering something Washington used to have a monopoly on: stability. The danger here isn't that the US will stop getting coffee, it's that it will stop getting the best coffee. The first shipments from each harvest will go to the markets suppliers trust most. America will get what's left, at a higher price, and on less favorable terms. This is how influence erodes, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, steady shift of loyalty and opportunity to other players. One year, you notice your favorite blend is harder to find. The next, you're paying more for beans that used to be cheaper. A few years later, you realize your country no longer has a seat at the table when global coffee prices are set, because the producers who once looked to you for leadership are now taking their cues from someone else. Coffee may seem like a small battlefield in the larger arena of global trade, but make no mistake, it's a warning shot. If America can lose ground here in a market it once controlled, it can lose ground anywhere. And the world is watching. Right now, your coffee might still look the same. The same mug, the same color, the same comforting steam curling upward in the morning light. But beneath that surface, something has already changed. And it's not just the price tag. Trade wars aren't abstract when they reach your kitchen table. They're not just numbers in a headline or speeches from podiums. They're in the taste of what you drink, the shelves at your grocery store, the menu board at your local cafe. Maybe you've already felt it, that slight bite in the flavor where there used to be smoothness. Maybe the bag you always bought is suddenly out of stock, replaced by something with a different origin printed on the label. Maybe your favorite cafe quietly switched beans, and you can't quite put your finger on why your latte doesn't taste like it used to. These changes didn't happen because coffee farmers suddenly forgot how to grow good beans. They didn't happen because you wanted something different. They happened because of a decision signed thousands of miles away by people who will never taste the difference themselves. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Coffee is just the start. Once you see how quickly politics can reshape something as simple, as intimate as your morning cup, it's hard not to wonder, what's next? Tea? Cocoa, olive oil? The things we take for granted are often the most vulnerable, precisely because we assume they'll always be there. That's the real cost of this tariff war. It's not just in dollars and cents, or even in lost market share. It's in the quiet erosion of choice, the shrinking of the world you thought you could count on, the realization that your habits, your rituals, can be rewritten without your consent. So the next time you pour that first cup of the day, take a moment. Ask yourself, is this still the coffee I chose? Or is it just the closest thing left? And when you've thought about that, tell me, would you pay more to keep the taste you love? Or would you settle for something different because there was no other choice? Because the answer to that question might just decide how this story ends.